Hello and welcome to another session for MG316. And in this session, we are going to look at employment relations in the United States. So let's look at the outline of today's tutorial. We are going to look at some of the key themes, historical context, the role of the government or the state, the employers, unions, collective bargaining, the 2000s and the early 2010s, variations in employment practices, Employee Free Choice Act, and finally we will conclude. Now, looking at some of the key themes, there has been high diversity of employment conditions in US system. Relatively low levels of unionization compared to other developed market economies, significant differences between unions and non-union sectors, decentralization of collective bargaining structures and strategy, possible regulatory intervention. So some of the things you will notice different in US compared to UK, which we studied last week. You will see that the unions here, the union density is actually quite low compared to UK, and there is very significant difference between the union and the non-union sectors as well, and the collective bargaining has been decentralizing. I did mention last week that when collective bargaining takes place at the enterprise level or at the plant level, it is said that collective bargaining is decentralized, whereas if collective bargaining takes place at the industry level, then collective bargaining has been said to be centralized. So there is decentralization of collective bargaining structures and strategy in USA. Some of the historical context. Early unions were formed by and were exclusive to skilled craftsmen. We have also seen this in UK, I believe, that the first trade unions to form were the craft unions. So likewise here in USA, the first unions to form and were exclusive to skilled craftsmen. The dominance of Taylorism or scientific management undermined the rationale for mainstream workers to act collectively to negotiate pay and working conditions. Now, what happens in scientific management, which was coined by Frederick Taylor, was that there is management prerogativeness. So, whatever the management says goes. The workers did not have any say. When an organization practices scientific management, workers usually do not have any say. Whatever the management says goes, whether you like it or not. And if you do not like it, you are fired or you leave the organization. So workers could not act collectively. Also, scientific management does not like unions. So workers are not organized. They don't have unions. Further, early capitalists were politically powerful and vigorously opposed the union movement. So the capitalists, the businesses, they were politically powerful and they did not like the union movement at all. Even the early successes of craft unions were hampered by the organized opposition of employers and anti-union employment laws. We saw that in UK, when Margaret Thatcher came into power, she restricted trade union movement and passed some anti-union employment laws. Likewise, in USA, from the beginning, they did not like any unions. and the employers, they were organized, and they lobbied the government to have anti-union employment laws. So unions were undermined and they were not really successful, even in the beginning with the craft unions. Continuing, it was not until the Great Depression of the 1930s that the unions first began to organize factory workers. So initially they organized the craft, or the unions were organized by the craft workers. Now, from 1930, when there was a Great Depression, the unions, they started to organize the factory workers as well. There was a great recession in the 1930s in USA. Many circumstances led to successful organization during the 1930s, including the Wagner Act 1935. We will look at this act a bit more in depth in a while. Note that the Wagner Act of 1935 is also called the National Labor Relations Act (NLRA), or also at times it was referred to as the New Deal. And there are two important things that this act did. It says here, which gave employees the federal guaranteed right to organize and to strike for the first time. So workers were given the right to organize for the first time, and they were also given the right to strike for the first time. In the 1940s and the 1950s, the union grew, though federal legislation restricted and regulated them. So even though unions was, their density was increasing, but the federal law restricted and regulated the unions. Collective bargaining arrangements secured during the war continued in peacetime. The 1960s and the 70s, much of the public sector was unionized. We have seen, like in UK, that the union density is higher in the public sector compared to the private sector, isn't it? And USA is no different. So now let's look at the government, the role of the state. The US state influences employment relations beyond its role as an employer in two main ways. First of all, direct regulation of terms and conditions of employment, a regulation of the manner in which organized labor and management relate to each other. So these are the two main ways in which the government influences employment relations apart from being an employer. The federal and state wage and hour laws provide for minimum levels of pay and overtime rates, but many workers are excluded from the operation of these laws. So note that USA has got minimum wages as well. However, individual states in USA, there are 50 states in USA, and individual states, they have their own laws with regards to the minimum wages. Even though the government has a federal law, however, the state governments, they also pass legislations with regards to minimum wages. However, many workers are excluded from the operation of these laws. Employment at will operates in US. What is employment at will? Employment at will is whereby the employers, they do not have to provide a just cause for dismissal of workers. So employers do not have to provide just cause for dismissal, reasonable notice, or severance pay when dismissing employees. That's employment at will. Here in the Pacific Island countries, we do not have employment at will. It is easy for any organization to hire an employee, but to fire them is very difficult. Employers usually have to provide a just cause for their dismissal. They cannot just fire them on the spot unless there is some serious misconduct and things like that. Apart from that, employers cannot fire the employees on the spot. Moving on to the NLRA. So the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, or the Wagner Act of 1935 provides rules establishing employee rights with respect to collective action. Some of these rules include union certification by secret ballot and the requirement for certified unions and employers to bargain in good faith. So, note that even though the Wagner Act did provide some protection for the workers and for the unions, however, it did not make collective bargaining compulsory. So, collective bargaining is voluntary in USA. It says bargain in good faith, which means collective bargaining is voluntary. It's up to the two parties if they want to engage in the collective bargaining process. Debate over whether union certification procedures unfairly restrict the right of the worker to organize into unions. There has been debate over that. Employment disputes in the US are resolved through the general court system or agreed arbitration procedures and not through specialist tribunals. And this results in high cost, long waiting times, greater variability in outcomes. So in USA, like what we have seen in UK, that usually the disputes are resolved by the employment disputes are resolved by employment courts or labor courts, or in UK's case we had the ICAS system, Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Service, and this resolved conflict, helped employers, unions, workers to resolve conflict, but no such mechanism is present in USA. So employment disputes are resolved in the normal court system of the country or via agreed arbitration procedures. So what happens is, since the normal court system is involved, this results in high cost, long waiting times, and greater variability in outcomes. Because, for example, what might happen is that the judge might not specialize in resolving employment disputes. So there will be greater variability in outcomes, isn't it? When you use the normal court system of the country to resolve employment disputes, there is a channel. In the Pacific, we do not have this. In the Pacific, we usually have some sort of a tribunal, employment tribunal, or a labor court or employment court, some mediation, some conciliation, or some sort of arbitration is present there before employment disputes go to the normal court system of the country. All right, moving on to the employers and their organizations. So, employers' organizations are relatively unimportant as there have never been national employers' confederation engaging in a full range of ER and IR activities. Unlike what we have seen in UK, USA does not have an umbrella body for employers association. UK has an umbrella body for employers association which was called CBI, which we discussed last week. But in USA, there has never been an umbrella body of employer association which engages in a full range of IR activities. But this does not mean that there are no employer associations present in USA. There are employer associations present in USA like chambers of commerce and things like that, but they do not have an umbrella body of employer associations. Some Employers' organizations have focused on union avoidance measures, including anti union litigation, lobbying, and publicity campaigns. So, some of the organizations or employer associations that are present in UK, they mostly focus on avoiding unions. They don't like unions at all. In contrast to the relative weaknesses of employers association, management consultants and law firms that represent employers play an active role in employment relations. So since the employers organization or the employer associations they are weak, the management consultants and law firms they play an active role in employment relations for the employers. And this obviously does not happen for free. Always there is a fee associated with this. And these are big businesses, big law firms, they represent employers and they play an active role in the resolving disputes and things like that. So that's about employers and their associations. Moving on to the unions. In 2014, union density was around 36% in the public sector and less than 7% in the private sector. Please take a note of this. You will see this in all the countries that we are going to study, that the public sector has more union density compared to the private sector. US unions are unique in their approach to business unionism, where they focus narrowly on providing benefits to existing members. So here in USA, the unions are usually classified and categorized as business unions. Why? Because of their narrow focus on providing benefits to just the current members, the existing members, as well as that these business unions they are not really looking after the workers in an organization. They mostly are the good boys of the management and they are just there to agree with the management. Unions have focused mostly on collective bargaining with an accompanied strike threat. So unions mostly they focus on the CB process. Unions have not formed a political labor party but often contribute funds to other political campaigns and most frequently those of the Democratic Party candidates. Unlike what we have seen in UK, whereby the umbrella body, the TUC, Trade Union Congress, did form a political party, the Labour Party in UK. Unlike that, here in USA, the unions have not and they did not form a Labour Party or a political Labour Party, but they do contribute funds to political campaigns and especially to the candidates of the Democratic Party. And note that there are two major political parties present in USA. One is the Democratic Party and the other one is the Republican Party. The Republican Party currently is in power. President is Donald Trump. Moving on to public sector unionism. A rapid increase in public sector unionism occurred in the 1960s and the 1970s. Federal, state, and local government employees are excluded from the coverage under the NLRA, the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act. Separate legal relations govern collective bargaining in each of these sectors. So the NLRA is the Wagner Act is mostly for the private organizations. The government employees they are usually excluded from coverage under the Wagner Act, but they do have some separate legal relations that govern the collective bargaining in these federal, state, and local government. As of 2015, all all but 9 states had laws providing at least some of their state or local government employees with the right to organize and bargain collectively. So, out of the 50 states, all but 9, that means 41 states were providing at least some sort of protection, some sort of things, some sort of rights to employees to organize and to bargain collectively. The public sector is the most heavily unionized sector, with just over one third of employees unionized. We saw that I think around 36% of the public sector is unionized. Moving on to the structure of union movement. National unions are powerful as they dictate strategy, control strike funds, and can establish and destablish local unions. So this tells you that the national union, which is AFL-CIO, we'll just look at that after this slide. AFL-CIO. This national union is quite powerful as they dictate strategy, they control the strike funds, and they can establish and destablish local unions. Local unions usually carry out day-to-day activities of the union movement, including the enforcement of employee rights under the collective agreement and conduct bargaining over the terms of new agreements and any resulting strike, though they can be led by national unions. So the day-to-day activities, they are mostly carried out by the local unions and not the national unions. The national unions advise, guide the local unions. The national centralization of strike funds has meant that unions have been able to develop common rules and sometimes to strike effectively. Since strike funds is held by the national unions, what this has allowed is that all the unions that are affiliated with AFL-CIO, they tend to develop common rules and they are able to strike effectively. That means they are successful in their strikes. So looking at the national umbrella body for the trade unions, the AFL-CIO. What does it stand for? The American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organization, AFL-CIO. So this is a federation of national unions and that includes a substantial share of union members. Initially, these were two separate unions. AFL was separate, CIO was separate. I think they combined in 1955 and they just added the two names together and came up with the AFL-CIO as the main name. So this is the umbrella body of trade union present in America. Their counterpart body present in UK is TUC, Trade Union Congress. So let's look at what are some of the roles of AFL-CIO. They are to provide a national political and public voice for the union movement, to resolve jurisdictional disputes among members, to enforce codes of ethical practices and policies against racial and sex discrimination, to provide a link to the international labor movement. So these are the main functions, the main roles of AFL-CIO. In the recent years, the AFL-CIO has championed new organizing methods which led to the 2005 breakaway of some national unions, resulting in a new federation called Change to Win. So we will look at Change to Win in a while as well. What has happened is due to some of the things that some of the unions did not agree with that were affiliated with the AFL-CIO. So they decided in 2005, they decided to break away from AFL-CIO and they formed their own union called Change to Win. Later on, we will see that Change to Win was not successful, and there still is just one umbrella body of trade union present in US, which is AFL-CIO. Let's look at union revitalization. One of the purposes of AFL-CIO organizing initiative is to diffuse successful organizing strategies used by affiliated unions and they guide the local unions. These strategies include using young, well educated organizers and involve extensive direct communication with prospective members with links to community groups such as churches. The AFL-CIO tried to modernize and broaden issues that attract union members, example, equal pay, childcare, and so forth. During the 1990s, 2000s, and the early 2010, there was little evidence that these strategies were working. So AFL-CIO, they started using young, well-educated organizers and also members with the links to community groups just to increase their membership, get more workers to join unions. They also try to modernize and broaden their issues. They do not just want pay and working conditions issues, but more than that, they want childcare, they want equal pay, they want employee involvement and participation, and so forth. But the evidence, or there has been little evidence that these strategies they were working. Moving on to the formation of Change to Win coalition. So let's look at this trade union body. Declining membership rates have led to divisions within the labor movement about how best to rebuild union strength. So trade union membership has been declining and there has been some discussion on how to increase their membership. But some people, some unions did not agree with how they should increase and rebuild the union strength. So in 1995, John Sweeney was elected the AFL-CIO president after challenging the existing strategy and the direction of the union movement. And in 2005, Sweeney's leadership was similarly challenged as major unions called for more resources to be directed to organizing and to encouraging the merger of smaller unions into larger, more powerful unions. So just like when John came into power in 1995, in 2005, his leadership was also challenged because the major unions that were affiliated with AFL-CIO, they wanted more resources to be directed to organizing and they wanted the smaller unions to merge with other unions and become larger unions to become more powerful so that they have a more collective voice. And then in May 2005, the four major unions, the SEIU, which is the Service Employees International Union, Unite Here, the IBT is the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and the LIUNA, which is the Laborers International Union of North America. So these four major unions, they issued a joint proposal to reform the AFL-CIO. But what happened is that these proposals were rejected. And in June 2005, the four dissenting unions, they left AFL-CIO to form the rival Change to Win coalition, CTW. So these four, SEIU, Unite Here, the IBT, and the LIU and A, these four unions, they left, and these were major unions, four major unions that were affiliated with the AFL-CIO. They left AFL-CIO and they formed the Change to Win coalition. Let's look at the impact of CTW, Change to Win. A key goal of the formation of CTW was to increase the focus on organizing. While the unions had joined CTW were more active organizers, they did not succeed in further increasing their organizing rate after the formation of CTW. So even though the unions that joined CTW were more active than AFL-CIO, they did not succeed. They were not successful in increasing their membership. The leadership divisions that had helped from the formation of CTW diminished with the retirement of John Sweeney in 2009, succeeded by Richard Trumka. By 2015, most of the Change to Win unions had rejoined the AFL-CIO, leaving only the IBT and SEIU in Change to Win. So Change to Win has again become a smaller union compared to AFL-CIO. And those unions that initially formed CTW have now gone back to AFL-CIO, hence leaving only two unions in CTW, the IBT and the SEIU. Looking at collective bargaining, in the non-union sector, pay and conditions are generally imposed unilaterally by the employer. So where there are unions, where the unions are not present, the workers usually do not have any say. The pay and the working conditions is just imposed by the employer. The workers do not get a say. In the union sector, the structure of collective bargaining is highly fragmented. This fragmentation is increasing, with most bargaining taking place at the single workplace level. Hence, collective bargaining is decentralized, as collective bargaining is taking place at a single workplace level. So we have got the enterprise level, we have got the plant level. So most of these collective bargaining is taking place at the enterprise level and at the plant level. Despite this fragmentation, there are some common features of collective bargaining agreements, and they are very detailed. They cover issues of pay, hours of work, holidays, pensions, health and life insurance, union recognition, management rights, the role of seniority in determining promotions, layoffs, and paid time off. Detail the handling and arbitration of grievances, and generally have a limited duration of 1 to 3 years. So these collective agreements, they are usually valid for 1 to 3 years, and they are very detailed and they cover a lot of issues apart from just pay and working conditions. They also cover holidays, pensions, health and life insurance, union recognition, management rights, and so forth. Even to the extent that they include how to handle grievances in the organization. Moving on to decentralization of collective bargaining structures. Until the early 1980s, the structure of unionized collective bargaining was a mixture of multi-employer, company-wide and plant-level bargaining. Since then, collective bargaining structures have been decentralized with the focus of bargaining shifting away from company-wide agreements to plant level. Varying work practices and pay systems have also contributed to collective bargaining decentralization. So until the early 1980s, there was a mixture of multi-employer, company-wide and plant-level bargaining. But since then, the collective bargaining has been decentralizing, focusing on to enterprise bargaining. Enterprise bargaining is whereby one collective agreement for just one organization, not multi-employer. Multi-employer, there are many organizations involved in one collective agreement. So company-wide is same as enterprise bargaining. Plant level bargaining is whereby a particular branch of that organization that has its own collective agreement. For example, there is a parent company, and this parent company has got many branches all over the country. So each of these locations, each of these branches have their own collective agreement. That is called plant level bargaining. So these are examples of decentralized collective bargaining, the enterprise bargaining and the plant level bargaining. Bargaining initiatives. In the recent years, unions have made significant changes to the processes and the outcomes of collective bargaining in an innovative effort to extend their membership. Corporate campaigns use media, political, financial, community, and regulatory pressures to build bargaining power. Other strategies link collective bargaining to organizing and political strategies. Triangulation strategies link organizing, politics, and collective bargaining. Cross national unionism remains a challenge for unions to counteract the power of multinational enterprises, outsourcing, and international economic pressures. So, trade unions still face difficulties because there are many MNCs present in USA, multinational corporations or multinational enterprises, and this becomes a challenge for the unions to counteract them. And because these multinational corporations, they operate in other countries as well, and wherever there is low cost of labor and things like that, so these companies start outsourcing and shifting their production to other countries and things like that. Moving on to the 2000s and the early 2010s, US based multinational enterprises have faced increasing economic competition. Rising healthcare costs and benefit have resulted in tensions in the union sector, where employers have not been able to unilaterally change benefits and or increase employee contribution payments as they have in the non-union sector. Retirement benefits were also a major cost or major issue for industries with a sizable retiree legacy costs. Outsourcing of services, including to overseas providers, was a growing concern. Despite such pressures, the US employment relations system remained relatively stagnant in the 2000 and the early 2010. So what has happened is that these multinational corporations, they have been facing economic competition. There has been rising healthcare cost and benefits, and this has resulted tensions in the union sector. Because what has happened in the non-union sector, where there have been rising healthcare costs and benefits, the employers, they just increase the employee contribution. of the payment. For example, if you have got health insurance, so the employer pays a certain amount and the employee pays a certain amount. And since the cost is increasing, what the employer has does is, since they decide on their own, unilateral decision making is there without consulting the employers just increase the employee contribution towards that uh, particular medical care or that insurance. But in the unionized sector, this does not happen, because the employers, they do not or they cannot just make decisions on their own. They need to consult the employees. So there have been tensions in the union sector. And also this was a major issue where the workers were almost retiring. Also there have been concerns whereby the organizations have been outsourcing. Moving on to variations in employment practices. Employment practices are diverse, and this is due to varying economic pressures across industries, the presence of a large, low wage, non unionized sector when managerial prerogative is high, differences between the union and the non union sectors, including growth in non union employment, imported employment practices from or of overseas based multinational corporations. Diversity in employment practices is often linked to diversity in pay systems. So there is quite variability in the employment practices, and these are the reasons as to why there is these variations. Right, economic pressures, low wage, non-unionized sector where the managerial productiveness is high compared to a unionized sector where equal decision making has to take place. Also some imported employment practices from overseas based multinational corporations. Finally, looking at the Employee Free Choice Act, the labor movement's major labor law reform initiative, the Employee Free Choice Act EFCA, was defeated in the US Congress in the 2009-2010, and the new labor reforms appear unlikely. So this was a major legislation which was supposed to be introduced. However, it did not, and it tried to reform a number of things. And some of the major provisions of EFCA involved allowing unions to organize through a card check recognition, facilitation of speedy processing of unfair labor practice claims, increased penalties on employers who unlawfully discharge employees, provision of interest arbitration if the parties are unable to negotiate a first contract. While some of these changes would have been significant, they did not signal a fundamental departure from the current system. After the failure of EFCA, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, attempted to achieve part of its intended reforms administratively by enacting rules to reduce delays in the union organizing election campaigns. So the Employee Free Choice Act was not successful. So still currently these USA still has the Wagner Act, the NLRA. Conclusion: diversity in US employment relations is high and increasing due to growth in non-union employment and the wide variety of union and non-union employment and pay practices. There is wide variation in collective bargaining practices and outcomes. Union revitalization initiatives have led to various organizing and bargaining innovations as unions attempt to extend membership in the face of increasing income inequality and international pressures. So this concludes employment relations in the USA. If you have any questions, any queries with regards to employment relations in USA, you can feel free, or you can send me an email. My email address is up there on Moodle, and a copy of this recording will also be uploaded on YouTube. If you feel that big blue button is not clear, you're not able to hear my voice, please look at the copy on YouTube, and you should be fine. All right, all the very best for your mid-semester test, which is next week. And the two countries that are covered in the mid-semester test is UK and USA. All right, see you next week. And in our next week's lecture, we are going to, or in our next week's tutorial, we are going to look at employment relations in Japan. Thank you.